There is a photograph that hung in the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport for decades that most visitors, moving through the rooms where history was made, walked past without stopping to study. It shows 5 girls. They are standing in a garden, the garden at the compound. The one facing the sea, and they are dressed in the white cotton dresses of a summer in the 1930s, and they are squinting slightly into the light of a day that was from the evidence of the photograph brilliant and warm. The oldest is 17. The youngest is 8. They are the daughters of Joseph Patrick Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, and they are smiling the smiles of children who have been told to smile for the camera and who are for this moment complying. Their names from oldest to youngest: Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia. Jean, look at the photograph long enough and something begins to trouble you. It is not in the smiles are real or real enough. It is not in the clothes or the garden or the light. It is something in the composition of what comes after. The knowledge of what will happen to each of these girls, what will be done to them, what will be taken from them, what they will carry, that knowledge, once you have it, makes the photograph impossible to look at innocently. Rosemary, the eldest daughter, will be taken to a surgeon in 1941 at 23 years old, and a procedure will be performed on her brain while she is awake, and she will emerge from it unable to walk properly, unable to speak coherently, unable to be the person she was before the surgeon began cutting, and she will spend the next 63 years in an institution in Wisconsin, visited first by no one, then by everyone who should have come sooner. Kathleen, the second daughter, the one they called Kick, will be dead at 28, in a plane falling apart above the mountains of France, flying toward a meeting with a father who she hoped would understand the life she had chosen against her family's wishes. Eunice will spend her adult life trying to repair, through the specific mechanism of action, the damage she could not undo. Patricia will see her Hollywood dreams dissolve in a marriage that the celebrity world could not sustain. Jean will build and serve and outlive all 8 of her siblings, carrying the memories of everyone to the end. 5 girls, 1 photograph, a summer day in the 1930s before the losses accumulated. This is their story. The Empire and its Daughters, Boston and Hyannisport, 1915–1938. To understand what the Kennedy daughters were born into, you must first understand what their father was building and what their mother was maintaining, and how the 2 projects, the building and the maintaining, shaped the air of every room those daughters grew up in. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. was not born to the wealth he eventually commanded. He was the son of Patrick Joseph Kennedy, a Boston saloon-keeper and ward politician who had clawed his way into the middle tier of Boston's Irish Catholic political establishment. And he inherited from his father the specific ambition of men who have watched power operate from just outside its circle, and who have decided they will not remain outside. He attended Harvard, not the Harvard that opened its finest rooms to Boston Irish, but the Harvard that let them in the door, and he graduated in 1912 and proceeded to build with the specific intelligence and specific ruthlessness that the task required the fortune that would eventually be estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars. Banking first. Then the stock market, where he operated during the 1920s with a skill and an ethical flexibility that the subsequent creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which Roosevelt appointed him to chair, the Fox to oversee the henhouse, would later make illegal. Then Hollywood, where he produced films and conducted romantic affairs with a combination that those who observed it at close range found difficult to separate. Then real estate and politics, and the ambassadorship to the court of St. James in 1938. When he took his entire family to London at the most pivotal moment in European history, and managed within 2 years to be recalled in disgrace for statements about Hitler and about England's capacity to survive that the diplomatic world found inexcusable. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy was, in her own way, as formidable as her husband. She was the daughter of John Fitzgerald Honey Fitz, the mayor of Boston, the congressman. The singing politician who understood before most people understood it that public life was performance, and who performed it with the specific Irish-American Catholic combination of sentimentality and steel that Rose had inherited entirely. She had grown up in the public eye. She knew its requirements. She attended Mass every day. She kept an index card file on each of her 9 children, their medical histories, their vaccination records, their academic progress, and she managed the household, the staff, the appearances, and the image with the efficiency of an institution rather than the warmth of a family. She had 9 children between 1915 and 1932, Joseph Jr. first, then John in 1917, then Rosemary in 1918, then Kathleen in 1920, then Eunice in 1921, then Robert in 1925, then Patricia in 1924, then Jean in 1928, then Edward in 1932. The daughters grew up in the specific environment of a household where excellence was not encouraged, it was demanded, where winning was expected and losing was a form of failure that the family's standards did not accommodate, where the boys were trained for power and the girls were trained for elegance, for the specific performance of accomplished femininity that the mid-century American Catholic establishment required of women who would eventually be the wives of important men. The girls were to be educated but not too ambitious, charming but not too forward, intelligent but always deferential to the men in the room. They were also, all of them, watched by the staff, by the press that followed the Kennedy family as the family's prominence grew, by each other, by parents who maintained always the surface. The surface was everything. The surface was the family's most carefully managed product. Beneath the surface, in the Toluca Lake of the Kennedy imagination, were the things that were not discussed. Rosemary, what the silence erased. She was born on September 13, 1918, during the height of the Spanish influenza epidemic, and the birth itself carried the first damage. The doctor was delayed. The nurse, following the protocol of an era that permitted nurses to follow protocols that should never have been permitted, told Rose to keep her legs closed, to hold the baby in the birth canal, while they waited for the physician to arrive. The baby's head remained in the birth canal for 2 hours. The oxygen deprivation that this produced was not understood at the time, and was not acknowledged for decades, but the damage was done in those 2 hours. In a room where a nurse was following instructions, and a mother was following instructions, and a baby was being harmed by the following of instructions. Rosemary Kennedy grew up visibly different from her siblings, though the difference was one that the family spent years trying to manage into invisibility. She was slower to walk, slower to speak, slower in the academic subjects that the Kennedy household treated as the primary measure of a child's worth. Private tutors were hired, specialists were consulted. Rose took her to experts. Joseph paid for whatever was recommended, because paying for things was Joseph's primary language of love, and because the underlying conviction was that enough money and enough effort would eventually produce the result required. A daughter who was indistinguishable from her sisters. But she kept a diary. This is the detail that humanizes what can otherwise become a narrative of pure victimhood. Rosemary Kennedy kept a diary. And the entries were simple and heartfelt, and written in the specific voice of a young woman who was attending dances and meeting people, and noticing the world with an attention and a warmth that the subsequent decades would not be allowed to continue developing. She went to London with the family in 1938, when her father was appointed ambassador. And in London, in a convent school with a Montessori program run by nuns who understood her needs and celebrated her progress rather than focusing on her limitations, she thrived. For the first time in her educational life, she thrived. She was presented at court before King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. She practiced the royal curtsy for hours, determined to perform it correctly. When she stumbled in the moment, the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, the nerves, the king and queen smiled as if nothing had happened. Rose never spoke of the stumble afterward. In her accounting, the presentation was a triumph. The management of the surface continued even in the moments where the surface briefly gave way. When the war began in September 1939 and the family returned to America, Rosemary left behind the environment where she had been happy. Back in the United States, now 21 years old, she understood things she could not fully articulate, that she was being supervised differently than her sisters, that freedoms available to Kathleen and Eunice were not available to her, that she was being managed. The understanding produced frustration, and the frustration produced behavior that those around her found alarming, the sneaking out at night, the mood swings, the moments of anger that the family could not predict or contain. Joseph Kennedy's response to these behaviors was not the response of a father concerned about his daughter's well-being. It was the response of a man concerned about his family's reputation and his son's political futures. What if she became pregnant? What if she said something inappropriate to a reporter? What if the public learned that the Kennedys' perfect family had a daughter who could not be made perfect? In 1941, he authorized a prefrontal lobotomy. He did not consult Rose. He did not consult the other children. He did not ask Rosemary whether she wanted the procedure. She was 23 years old. The surgeons performed the operation while she was awake, asking her to recite prayers and sing songs as they cut, monitoring her responses to determine when they had cut enough. They continued until her words became nonsense, until the songs stopped making sense, until there was nothing coherent left to monitor. Then they stopped. She emerged unable to walk without assistance, unable to speak intelligibly, her left arm partially paralyzed. The woman who had kept the diary, who had danced at parties and sailed with her siblings and practiced the royal curtsy until she could almost make it perfect, that woman did not emerge from the operating room. Joseph arranged for her to be sent to St. Coletta's, an institution in Jefferson, Wisconsin, 800 miles from Hyannisport. He built her a private cottage, separate from the other residents. He assigned nuns to her care, and then he told the rest of the family that Rosemary had gone to Wisconsin to teach children with special needs. He forbade contact. He forbade questions. The subject of Rosemary became, in the Kennedy household, a silence that everyone maintained because the person who had built the household demanded the maintenance. Rose Kennedy did not see her daughter for 20 years. She accepted the lie and kept the silence and did not ask to speak with Rosemary on the telephone, and did not visit Wisconsin, and did not, in those 20 years, publicly acknowledge that the management of her husband's authority had required the abandonment of her child. The silence lasted until Joseph had a stroke in 1961 that left him unable to enforce it. Then the siblings began to visit, slowly, horrified by what they found. When they came with the guilt of people who had not known, and who now knew, and who could not undo what had been done. Rosemary would live in Wisconsin until 2005. She would die at 86 years old, with her sisters and her brother Ted beside her. In the end, she was not alone. In the decades between 1941 and the lifting of the silence, she had been entirely alone in a cottage in Wisconsin, while the family she had known sailed and competed and married and became famous. Kathleen, the life she chose, and the price she paid. Kathleen Agnes Kennedy was born February 20, 1920, and she was the one who could make her father laugh. The one whose quicksilver wit and irreducible energy earned her the nickname Kick, given by Joseph Sr. for the irrepressible quality of her personality, the sense that she would kick her way into any room and make it hers. She arrived in London in 1938 with her family and proceeded to become the most popular American in British society, which was not a small achievement in 1938, when British society was not always inclined toward Americans. She was named Debutante of the Year. She called the Duke of Marlborough by a nickname that made him laugh when it should have offended him. She chewed gum on the streets of Mayfair. She was so entirely herself, so unconstrained by the formality that governed every other interaction in those circles, that the formality dissolved around her. At a party she met William Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire, one of the most eligible and one of the most genuinely decent young men in British aristocracy. He was quieter than she was, more reserved, the product of Eton and of a family whose history stretched back centuries. She was louder, more American, the product of Hyannisport and the Kennedy table where debate was the primary form of family affection. They fell in love with the specific completeness of people who recognize in each other the thing they have been missing. There was one insurmountable problem. Billy was Protestant. Any children from their marriage would have to be raised in the Church of England. For Rose Kennedy, whose Catholicism was the structural framework of her self-understanding, this was not a preference to be negotiated. It was a line that could not be crossed. Rose opposed the relationship with the specific ferocity of a woman for whom faith and reputation and family image are not separable from love. She told Kick she was choosing worldly status over her immortal soul. She manipulated social situations, withheld approval, made it clear that choosing Billy meant choosing against the family. The war intervened. The Kennedys went home in 1939. Kick spent the next 3 years in America, writing letters, trying other suitors, finding no one who was Billy. In 1943, she found her way back to England with the Red Cross, and she found her way back to Billy, and in May 1944 they married in a civil ceremony at Caxton Hall. Rose did not come to the wedding. She could not speak to Kik on the phone. Only one family member attended, Joseph Jr., Kik's oldest brother, who defied his parents to stand beside his sister as her witness. The marriage lasted 5 weeks before Billy received orders to France. 4 weeks after the wedding, he was gone. On September 10, 1944, he was killed by a German sniper in Belgium. He was 26 years old. 3 weeks before Billy died, Joseph Jr.'s plane exploded over the English Channel. The brother who had stood beside her at the wedding, gone. The husband she had defied her family and her church to marry, gone. She was 24 years old, a widow, a woman who had been excommunicated from her faith, and she had lost in the space of weeks the 2 men who had most fully been on her side. She stayed in England. The Cavendish family had received her. The Duke and Duchess of Devonshire had accepted the American girl their son had loved enough to marry against every conventional consideration, and they gave her a title and a place, and a sense of belonging that her own family had withheld. She was the Marchioness of Hartington. She had standing in England of a kind that Rose Kennedy's approval could not provide and could not take away. In 1946 she met Peter Fitzwilliam. He was wealthy, bold, alive in a way that the grief of the previous 2 years had made Kik need, someone who made her laugh. He was also married, divorcing, but married. It was, by Rose Kennedy's accounting, infinitely worse than the Protestant marriage, a married man. The family made clear that this would be the final breach. Rose threatened complete disownment. Kik didn't stop. She had already been excommunicated. She had already lost a husband and a brother. She was not going to give up another chance at happiness because her mother could not approve of it. She wanted her father's blessing. Joseph was always the more pragmatic of the 2 parents, less bound by religious doctrine, more likely to understand the calculation she was making. He was traveling to Paris in May 1948. She arranged to fly there and meet him, to explain about Peter, to ask for something like understanding. On May 13, 1948, Kik and Peter Fitzwilliam boarded a small aircraft at a Paris airport, heading to the French Riviera before her meeting with her father. The plane flew into a severe storm near Privas. The turbulence was violent, the clouds impenetrable. The pilots lost their orientation. When they broke through into clear air, they were in a steep dive, and they pulled back on the controls, and the stress tore the plane apart, a wing, then the engines, then the fuselage spinning into the ravine. Kathleen Kennedy Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington, died on impact. She was 28 years old. Joseph came to England for the funeral. She was buried in the Cavendish family plot at St. Peter's in Edensor, near Chatsworth House, the great estate she would have presided over as Duchess if Billy had lived. Rose did not come. She checked into a hospital for unspecified reasons. The mother and daughter had never reconciled. They never would. Her tombstone reads, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." The Cavendish family chose the words. They knew her. The weight that remained, Eunice, Patricia, Jean. The deaths, Joe Jr. in 1944, Kik in 1948, Rosemary's disappearance in 1941, did not break the surviving sisters. They changed them. They produced, in 3 women who would live long lives, the specific quality of people who have learned from the worst what the worst costs, and who have decided what they are going to do with the knowledge. Eunice Mary Kennedy was born July 10, 1921, the 3rd daughter. The one who had formed the closest bond with Rosemary in childhood, the sister who had sailed and swum alongside Rosemary without treating her as different, who had included and encouraged and protected her from the cruelty of a world that did not understand. When Eunice learned the truth about the lobotomy, about what their father had authorized, about where Rosemary actually was and in what condition, the knowledge became the organizing fact of her adult life. Not a grief to be managed, but a call to action. Not something to be hidden, but something to be transformed. She married Robert Sargent Shriver Jr. on May 23, 1953. Sargent was accomplished in his own right. He would direct the Peace Corps under President Kennedy, serve as ambassador to France, run for the Democratic vice presidential nomination. Together they had 5 children, including Maria Shriver, who would become a broadcast journalist and marry Arnold Schwarzenegger. But Eunice's true work was what she did with the inheritance of Rosemary. In 1957, she became executive vice president of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, and she immediately redirected it away from generic Catholic charities toward the specific and overlooked world of people with intellectual disabilities, the people who were, in 1957, routinely institutionalized, hidden from public life, denied education, treated as less than fully human by the society that was supposed to be caring for them. She had seen what happened when a family treated a disabled child as a shameful secret. She had seen it at the most intimate possible distance. She was not going to allow it to be the norm. In 1962, she opened a summer day camp at her Maryland farm for children and adults with intellectual disabilities. The goal was simple and radical: find out what they could do, not dwell on what they couldn't, celebrate capability, provide challenge. The campers thrived beyond anything their families or their caretakers had predicted. They raced and jumped and swam and improved and laughed and demonstrated day after day that what had been assumed about their limitations was not a description of who they were, but a description of what they had been denied. On July 20, 1968, at Soldier Field in Chicago, the first International Special Olympics Games opened. 1,000 athletes from the United States and Canada competed in more than 200 events. Olympic decathlon champion Rafer Johnson was there as an advisor. A young runner carried a torch to light a flame honoring John F. Kennedy, dead now for 5 years. Eunice spoke at the opening, and the words she chose captured everything she had understood since she first learned what had been done to her sister. The Chicago Special Olympics proves a fundamental fact: that exceptional children with intellectual disabilities, can be exceptional athletes. The oath she introduced has become one of the most quoted sentences in the history of sport. "Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt." Special Olympics grew into something no single organization had ever been before. A global movement that gave millions of people with intellectual disabilities not just competition, but visibility, dignity, the public acknowledgement that they existed and were capable and mattered. By the time Eunice died in 2009, the movement encompassed millions of athletes in more than 170 countries. She had taken her father's worst decision and turned it into humanity's gain. This is not a small thing. This is one of the most significant individual acts of moral transformation in the 20th century. Patricia Kennedy, born May 6, 1924, carried her dreams of film production into a Hollywood marriage to British actor Peter Lawford, a member of the Rat Pack, a man through whom she entered the inner circle of American celebrity. The Lawford home became a gathering place where politics and entertainment mixed, where Sinatra came, where Marilyn Monroe came, where her brother the president came to relax in a world that was less formal than the White House required. She had 4 children and seemed from the outside to have the glamorous life she had always wanted. The marriage was troubled in the specific ways that marriages are troubled when substance use and the pressures of celebrity combine with the particular difficulty of being simultaneously a Kennedy and a Lawford, where both names carried enormous weight and neither provided the ordinary domestic stability that marriages require. They separated after the president's death in 1963 and divorced in 1966. Patricia moved back to New York. The film production career she had hoped for did not materialize in the form she had imagined, but she founded the National Committee for the Literary Arts and spent her later years supporting the literary world with the same energy she would have brought to the cinema. She died in 2006, at 82, having lived long enough to see the Kennedy family become something more complicated and more human than the dynasty her father had intended. Jean Ann Kennedy, born February 20, 1928, sharing a birthday with Kathleen, as if the calendar was insisting on a connection across the years, was the youngest of the 5 sisters and the longest-lived of all 9 Kennedy children. She watched her older sisters from the beginning, learning from their choices, absorbing the consequences of the family's patterns of control and expectation, understanding what the Kennedy name gave and what it cost. She married Stephen Edward Smith in 1956 and raised 4 children in a life that was quieter, by design, than several of her siblings. But like Eunice, she was moved by Rosemary. In 1974, she founded Very Special Arts, an organization dedicated to ensuring that people with disabilities had access to the arts, to music, theater, dance, the creative life that the world had long assumed was not for them. Very Special Arts grew into an international organization that has since reached millions of people in more than 50 countries. In 1993, President Clinton appointed her United States ambassador to Ireland. It was a fitting role for the granddaughter of Honey Fitzgerald, for the daughter of the family's long Irish-American political tradition, for the woman who represented a country her family had always treated as the source of its deepest identity. She served until 1998, during the crucial years of the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland, when the presence of an American ambassador with genuine personal investment in Ireland's well-being mattered. She died on June 17, 2020 at 92 years old. She outlived all 8 of her siblings. She was the last one carrying the memories, the last one who had known them all, the sisters in the white dresses, the brothers, the ones who were gone. The curse and what it actually was, they call it the Kennedy curse. And the phrase has been used so many times that it has become the shorthand for a pattern that resists shorthand. The accumulation of violent death and premature loss and public humiliation across multiple generations of one family, a pattern so consistent that the word curse seems almost reasonable. Joe Jr. dead at 29 when his plane exploded over the English Channel in 1944. Kik dead at 28 in the French mountains in 1948. President Kennedy dead at 46 in Dallas in 1963. Bobby Kennedy dead at 42 in Los Angeles in 1968. Ted Kennedy's Chappaquiddick. David Kennedy, Bobby's son, dead of an overdose in 1984. Michael Kennedy dead in a skiing accident in 1997. John Kennedy Jr. dead in a plane crash in 1999 at 38. The word curse implies an external force, something visited upon the family from outside. But the Kennedy sisters' story suggests a different kind of understanding, that much of what looked like a curse was the compounded consequence of the specific way Joseph Kennedy Sr. ran his family, the relentless pressure to perform, the subordination of individual well-being to family image. The control of information and the enforcement of silence around the things that were painful and inconvenient, the specific way that daughters were trained for ornament rather than agency, while sons were trained for power without adequately being trained for its emotional costs. Rosemary was not cursed. She was harmed by a nurse following protocol, by a birth injury that was not understood, and then by a father who authorized the destruction of her cognitive capacity because he was more concerned about scandal than about his daughter. The lobotomy was not fate. It was a decision made by a specific man in a specific year for specific reasons that had nothing to do with Rosemary's well-being. Kathleen was not cursed. She was a woman of extraordinary vitality and capacity for love who was punished by a mother whose religious rigidity could not accommodate her daughter's choices, for choosing the people she chose and living the life she wanted to live. She was flying toward her father in the hope that he might understand what her mother could not, and she died in the mountains. The plane crash was not a curse. It was a storm and a small aircraft and the specific fatal combination of those two things. The tragedy was real. The curse was a story people told to avoid the harder accounting. What the surviving sisters understood and what their lives demonstrated was that the pattern was not inevitable. That the family's particular combination of privilege and control and silence did not have to reproduce itself indefinitely. That you could take what had been done and refuse to pass it forward, refuse to maintain the silences, refuse to treat human beings as problems to be managed rather than people to be loved. Eunice refused. Jean refused. The refusal was the most important thing they did. The legacy and the light when Rosemary Kennedy died on January 7, 2005 at 86 years old, her sisters Eunice, Patricia and Jean were beside her. So was her brother Ted. They had spent decades making sure she was never alone again, visiting, bringing her to family gatherings, including her in the family from which she had been excluded for 20 years at her father's order. She had not been restored to what she was before the lobotomy. The damage of 1941 was irreversible, and nothing that the family did in the subsequent decades could undo it. But she had not been alone. She had been seen and visited and held, and she died with her family around her. The Special Olympics exist because of Rosemary. Very Special Arts exists because of Rosemary. The Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, named by Congress in 2008, for the sister who had used her position and her grief to change what the world understood about intellectual disability, exists because of Rosemary. Legislation across dozens of countries protecting the rights and dignity of people with disabilities traces, in some direct or indirect way, to the movement that Eunice built from the fact of what had been done to her sister. What Joseph Kennedy had meant as a shameful secret became, in the hands of his daughters, one of the most significant legacies in the history of disability rights. The thing he had hidden became the thing they spent their lives making visible. This transformation is not simple to talk about. It does not redeem what was done to Rosemary. It does not give back the 60 years she spent in Wisconsin, or the dances she did not attend, or the diary entries she did not write. It does not give Kathleen back her father's understanding, or her mother's forgiveness, or the years she would have lived if the plane had not gone down in the mountains. It does not resolve the specific, irreducible grief of 5 sisters growing up in a family that loved them in the ways it was capable of loving, and failed them in the ways it was not capable of preventing. But it means that the suffering was not only suffering. That the daughters took what was given to them, the privilege and the wound, the platform and the pain, and they used them together, refusing to let the image be the only legacy. The Kennedy legacy is most commonly spoken of in terms of the brothers, the president, the attorney general, the senator. The men who held power, who ran for office, who were assassinated and mourned in public, whose faces are on the walls of courthouses and schools and airport terminals across America. But the sisters built something the brothers could not have built, because the brothers were building power and the sisters were building from grief. The Special Olympics is the proof. What started as a summer camp on Eunice Shriver's Maryland farm became, across the decades, the largest sports organization in the world for people with intellectual disabilities. More than 6 million athletes compete in its programs today. The organization operates in nearly 200 countries. The oath, "Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt," has been taken by more people than can be counted. This is what Eunice made from the fact of Rosemary, from the silence her father enforced. From the specific guilt and horror of a sibling who learned, as a young adult, that her sister had been institutionalized and her family had been told a lie about why. She made the largest possible response to the smallest possible thing, a father who was embarrassed by a daughter who did not meet his standards. She took that embarrassment and answered it on behalf of every person who had ever been reduced to a problem to be managed, with a movement that said, "You are not a problem, you are a person, and you deserve to compete." Epilogue: The Garden at Hyannisport. The photograph still exists, the 5 girls in the white dresses squinting into the summer light smiling for the camera. Rosemary is the oldest in it. She is 17, and she has no idea what will happen to her in 1941, and she is smiling the smile of a girl who is living in the summer and who does not know that summers end. Kathleen is beside her, 16, the one who will become the most popular American in London, the one who will defy her mother and marry for love and die in the mountains of France at 28. She does not know this yet. She is smiling. Eunice stands next to Kathleen, 14, the one who will build the Special Olympics from the ruins of her family's worst decision, the one who will win the Presidential Medal of Freedom and have a national institute named after her. The one who will turn private grief into public good on a scale that the world will remember. She does not know this yet either. Patricia is 11 and Jean is 7, and the photograph is a summer in the 1930s, and the sea is behind them and the losses have not come yet, and they are just 5 girls in a garden looking into the light. They would have their photographs taken many times in the years that followed, at debutante balls and state dinners and White House receptions and film premieres and diplomatic functions and charity galas. The world photographed them in the gowns and the pearls and the specific elegance of women who had been trained since birth to be photographed well. But this one, the 5 girls in the garden, is the one that matters. Before the silence descended around Rosemary, before Kik flew into the storm, before the weight of the family's darkness began to accumulate in ways that could not be managed or photographed away, they were just sisters. 5 girls who would grow up to change the world in ways their father never intended, and their mother could not have imagined, and their brothers, for all their power, could not have achieved. They changed it because of what they suffered. Because of what was done to Rosemary and what was taken from Kathleen, and what was required of all of them in the service of an image that was never quite true. Because Eunice refused to let the silence continue. Because Jean refused to let the arts be reserved for people who had never known difficulty. Because Patricia kept showing up, even when the Hollywood dreams dissolved, Because showing up is what Kennedys do even when the showing up is harder than it looks. They were haunted. The Kennedy legacy is haunted by the men who died too young and by the woman who lived too long in Wisconsin, and by the specific American myth of Camelot which promised perfection and delivered instead. The very human reality of a family capable of extraordinary grace and extraordinary cruelty in equal measure. The haunting is real, so is the grace. They are not separate things, they never were. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.